Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I am your host, Olga Peters. In just a moment, I will introduce you to our guests. But for those who are new to the Happy Hour, we talk about how things in Montpelier shake out for, well, basically the rest of us. And you can find us on Apple Podcasts, as well as the Montpelier Happy Hour Facebook page, Emily's website, and YouTube. Oh, and BCTV, I can't forget them. So I want to introduce to the show regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who is one of 3 representatives for the town of Brattleboro. Hi, Emily.
Good afternoon, Olga.
Yes, we're pre-recording this. You will see this hear this on the radio on Friday, but this afternoon, it is Monday. So you look lovely in your sunlight.
I'm trying.
I also want to welcome to the show, Rich Holschuh. Hello, Rich.
Quai.
Rich is a spokesperson for the Elnu Abenaki. He is also the director of Atowi, which is an educational organization, fairly new, Rich. Are you located at the retreat farm?
So in name, I'm working remotely right now, but retreat farm is our de facto headquarters. Yeah.
And could you tell us a little bit about Atowi?
Certainly. Atowi is an Abenaki word. It means together in space and time. It's a concept, and it describes quite aptly the approach that we would like to use in connecting with people in community and in place. So that sort of sums up our mission: to raise Native voices, increase awareness, tell stories that people haven't heard before, which actually inform their own lives and their sense of being in this place. And then when all of that is sort of laid out there, then to examine what we do with it, how we got here and what do we do now.
Thank you, Rich. And that feels so core to part of what we want to talk about today, which is land sovereignty, as it's often described in the State House right now, with some bills that are, I believe, currently in committee, and land access and home ownership, particularly for communities who have been traditionally marginalized or left out altogether of the process. Just for folks' education, if they want to go to vermont.gov, they can look up H232 and H273, which are 2 of the bills we may mention today. Rich, I want to start with you. Can you talk to us a little bit from your perspective about what land access or land sovereignty means for you?
Okay. I will attempt to approach this both as an individual, as a person, and to express some of the viewpoints for the people that I represent, that I have been asked to represent.
Thank you.
So those aren't always the same thing, but there is overlap. So I approach this work from my own convictions that we as people are intimately connected to the earth herself as our mother, that we are dependent to no end, and we don't act like it. And so I want to encourage a movement back toward that recognition and that acknowledgement, which I see as a movement back toward balance as an operative principle. I live in this place. We know it as Brattleboro today. It is traditionally known as Wantostagok. That is the Abenaki name for this place as a referent. It refers to the West River, what we call the West River today, which is traditionally known as the Wantostuk. From that, we get the word Wantostagok, and that word is memorialized across the river in the mountain, in the person of the mountain that straddles the Chesterfield-Hinsdale border, Mount Wantosticket, which many of us have climbed, and which we admire every day if you live here. I like to think that that mountain basically defines who we are here without us knowing it.
Mm-hmm.
Land is defining us, and we get New Hampshire to pay for it. So, it's like the best of both worlds, right? That's our mountain. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like that underlying sense of the mountain is there, and that's how we see ourselves. But we don't give it that precedence. We don't acknowledge it as an equal, if not the fact that we actually depend on that mountain and everything else around us for our own existence. We would not be here without these things that we tend to look at as resources or as commodities. We take them for granted and we put ourselves in charge of them and over them. And I think that the sense of moving toward balance is a reordering of priorities and placing oneself in the middle as an equal in equity. And so that's how I approach it. Now, many of these things are reflected in a traditional indigenous sense of relationship with land, including amongst the Abenaki. Again, generalizations can be dangerous, but that does carry through that sense of identity with the land, and that plays out in the literally in the dictionary definition for indigeneity, where if you look it up in your Webster's, it'll say that it's the original people of a place, and so we tend to pin that label of indigeneity on the people, whoever they might be: Mohawk, Passamaquoddy, Dene, Apache, whoever they might be. We look at those people; those are indigenous people over there. But what we're forgetting is that the place they came from, it's the land that makes them indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not connected to a particular place and all you do is drift around, you're not indigenous. The reality being, many indigenous people have been displaced from their homes, but those roots run very deep. And we can't just look at current reality or the last several hundred years as being reflective of what that is supposed to mean. Mm-hmm. So to the Abenaki, and I speak for Elnu Abenaki when I say this place in southern Vermont is seen as themselves. They are the land, and the land is them. And we get into politics here with people who were here a very long time ago, people who are here now, people who are not here yet, new arrivals. We get into all of this very, very complex issue of who is who and what is what and all that kind of thing. But to drill down to the basics, the place to start, indigenous people are the original people of a place, and there is nothing more significant than that place to them. That is how they define themselves. And that is a way of being in the world that I think we would all do well to learn from. If we all acted like that, we wouldn't be misbehaving and acting poorly as much of our contemporary world is doing, and things are not going well, and we need to figure out a better way. And so this is the value in bringing these stories to the fore and sharing them and all learning together what this could look like. So that's where I come from. This is how I'm representing the community that I stand for, and what I would like to share with other people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rich. Emily, as a lawmaker, mm-hmm. who part of what you do is look at statutes and bills, including things around land ownership and home ownership and regulations and those sorts of details. Mm-hmm. How does Rich's work, what Rich just said, resonate with you?
So I think there's sort of two lines of thinking come to mind. One, I think lately, in the last few years, as we've talked about land sovereignty and often in the context of reparations or historic wealth gaps, or even a return to indigenous farm practices, I think often we talk about sort of delivering private ownership of land to people who have had the opportunity to own that land taken from them over from slavery, from Jim Crow, from genocide, from forced removal, from all of those things. And that the sort of repair and restore political move is often about easing loaning practices to make them less racist, or prioritizing land ownership or farm ownership for indigenous or Black people or people of color. And so that's sort of one tract of restore and repair that I think is talked about a lot. And in the bills you mentioned seems to be sort of the priority. The other path that is sitting with me more in terms of what Rich was just talking about is the idea of really getting much clearer with ourselves around what the rights of home ownership means and diffusing those rights further. So some examples are our current use laws around land and how folks own land but are able to pay less property taxes because that land is sort of being used in some way towards the common. It's being cared for, it's being, they're being true custodians to that land. But I think if we're really going to move towards us being of the land, each of us being of the land and the land being of us, then we need to move much more towards that land that we're sort of coming to recognize and incentivizing as the commons needs to also we need to do away with the idea of trespassing on that land, or allow hunting and fishing on that land. That someone is the custodian of that land, but that doesn't mean that they have control over the land. It means that they care for the land. And so that's sort of one angle of that. Other pieces are, last year we passed a very small law, but I think very meaningful, around restoring sort of free hunting and fishing rights to anyone who is a member of an Abenaki band. And so those are other pieces around really expanding what it means to have a commons, that we are all of the commons and we all have a responsibility to care for the commons. And so I think there's ways of using land regulation and using taxation that really help us move much more towards that vision of stewardship. And then I think some of what we are doing, which is really about making sure that everyone can own and protect and privatize, which I absolutely, when I think about the wealth gap and disparities in health outcomes because of the wealth gap and people's access to food and sovereignty and all of those things, I understand that under capitalism, if some people have, feel that they have sovereignty because they own land, then it's important to make sure that everyone can have that opportunity. But I'm not sure if if I'm have the opportunity to create policy or a world in the vision that Rich is describing here around actual sovereignty, meaning, a real custodial spirituality, that's necessarily the best path.
Well, I think, Rich, Emily is touching on some of the issues you and I have talked about just in conversation, that as Emily said, these two bills, H232 and H273, are trying to redress harm and provide access to land or home ownership and funding that people may have traditionally been excluded from. But you have mentioned that some of these bills, you're concerned they're actually could potentially reinforce some problems that are inherent around land ownership, private land ownership, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, Emily already touched on this. These attempts to provide repair and address the inequities are they're well intentioned. They come from a good place. They recognize the problems that are rampant around all of these things, and they are approaching that problem head on with some solutions within the system that created them in the first place.
Right.
So I would say that personally, I feel that the system, the system's broken, right? So these are attempts to fix that. The system itself is inherently flawed from my perspective, but it is the system we have, and it's firmly entrenched. It's firmly entrenched. It is not going to change this year. It's not going to change in 10 years. However, I try to operate with a set of ideals in mind when I guide my actions. I think we all do that to some degree, and we're trying to move towards something. And in my case, that's, as I said, balance and putting humans back into relationship with land as an equal. And when I say when I'm using land in the sense of everything that is here, other than human, all of our relations, they all have rights too. But that's the ideal, and when we have to start somewhere. So these bills attempt to start somewhere. I would also like to see an opening made, some space made somehow for some attempt to carve out some room for something outside of that system. Mm-hmm. And I think starting with indigenous people who already hold these values and who have been cut off from the ability to practice those values, that's a good place to start. As a way toward moving toward those ideals. So yeah, the bills that we have in play, they work within that system. They attempt to fix what is seen as broken. But they stay in that system of private property, humans being the ones with the rights. Everything has the same rights as far as I'm concerned. And whether they have a voice or not, you need to recognize that. We wouldn't put a person who's differently abled and not being able to speak in that position. They have those rights. The land can't speak for itself. We have to speak for it. We're responsible for that. We speak for everything else, the rivers, the toads, the pine trees. That is our responsibility as human beings, the way I look at it from a traditional standpoint. So I want to hold that high, that set of values high, and move toward it. And I don't oppose these bills. I support them to the degree that they're trying to address significant problems. I also want to pursue this other line of thinking, which Emily alluded to, that second track, where we start to recognize the commons, that the commons are not enshrined and protected very well in our system of laws at all. It is the individual and property rights that go with that, or individual rights. I would suggest that these individual rights that are held so high in this country are seen through indigenous eyes in a very different way. It is not about individual rights. It is about community rights. And you are nothing outside of community. And it's this rampant individualism. And I'm going off the tracks here, but this is rampant individualism with the human at the top that is symptomatic of this entire disease of separation instead of being in relation. It's a disease of separation. And private property rights are, right on the top of the heap as far as manifesting that dogma.
A few weeks ago, we had on the show, we spent the hour talking about substance use disorder. And just sort of want to reference that for a minute, because most of the folks in that movement will name that as a disease of separation too. And so I just want to sort of, so there are so many threads that connect all of these conversations and all of these challenges that we're having.
Well, I think even, a lot of people, what's been so painful about this pandemic has been, once you get past the economic upheaval or the hits their families have taken in one form or another, the social distancing and being disconnected from each other has been very painful for most people who maybe didn't acknowledge or realize that pain before. So this might be a great time for conversations like this, because we may have the widest number of people who understand that disease of disconnection in a new way. Because it's one thing to tell a story, it's another thing to have people listen.
That's right.
Rich, we have about 5 minutes before we need to hear from some of our underwriters. And I just want to touch base with you. When you talk to folks who some of these concepts might be new to them, what do you feel folks need to understand or grapple with, maybe in a new way that they haven't before?
Oh, wow. That's a very pragmatic and practical question.
I'm annoying that way.
No idea. Excuse me. I have some papers blowing in the wind. Yeah. So when you broach these subjects to folks who may not have heard of them, and you're right, probably most of them have not. First of all, their eyes may cross or glaze over because they have a hard time seizing on that. And then if some of it starts to make some sense to them, then they think you're kind of crazy, because that'll never work. And then what underlies a lot of this is the fear of change, of course. Don't take my rights away from me. Don't infringe on my property rights, my individual rights. And that's because that's all they know. I mean, that's the world we operate in. I would say that it's not what you think it is. Nobody's taking anything from everybody. It's all being shared. And you still have to have societal codes of conduct. Like, you don't run into somebody's house and take their stuff. That is your personal property. But by the same token, it's not right for somebody to own 3,000 acres and have it posted and keep other people off of it. That's ignoring the public commons completely, and putting yourself on top of an already elevated pile of humanity that's on top of everything else. It's just, again, separation exacerbated and exalted. So I think it's really difficult to open ears and get to that point where we can even start to talk about this. It's talk that's worth having. I think there are examples that can be shown. I'm not going to get into that right now of how this can work. And I think when you bring it right down to the individual and to the place that they're familiar with, and you explain it to them, people can start to wrap their heads around it, which is why I think that it's really important to start where you live, right here. And with the individual person face to face. Again, it's difficult that we can't speak with each other, because I have yet to run into somebody who, after talking with them, says that I'm crazy. They say, well, what you say makes a lot of sense. So there is commonality there. It has to be accessible, and people have to be able to wrap their heads around it and internalize it themselves. And that's what passing new bills are about, right. trying to get to those things that we can do right now, keeping the other things in mind. That I hold out hope for that.
Well, and along with, I think what you're touching on too is this cultural shift, and we have to acknowledge that some of the things that have formed in our society over time, such as posting land, as an example, formed for a variety of reasons, such as people's fear, or maybe other people not respecting folks' personal space or their own being. Fears of being sued. And so like all those little pieces also have to be peeled away, I think, so that people feel, for lack of a better term, not afraid enough to start considering the commons again as a safe place.
Yeah.
Let's head off to break so we can hear from some of our underwriters, but the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment. Welcome back to the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and if you are just joining us, I'm speaking with representative and regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, as well as Rich Holschuh from Atowi, and also a spokesperson for the Elnu Abenaki. Thank you so much for being with us today, both of you. Emily, let's start with you. You had a really great question that you raised during the break. I'd love it if you just kind of throw that into the pot again.
Yeah, and before I jump into that, just want to say that the views and opinions expressed on this show are those of the host and the guests, and maybe some of the listeners, but not necessarily the radio station or the TV station. So for instance, if we talk about doing away with private property entirely, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily what the radio station wants to do.
Right. So send your angry email to the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com, not the radio station.
Exactly. Thank you. So, I love talking about these issues and thinking through them, and really regularly struggle with reforming something from within the existing system versus crafting new system, and what's a person to do when they're in the legislature in such a circumstance. And so one piece is just, a bill I'm working on with a colleague for next year around just exempting property that is owned by any of the Abenaki bands from property taxes.
Sorry, Emily, your audio just froze a little bit there. Could you say that again?
I can say that again. So one bill that I'm working on with a colleague is fairly small in terms of dollars, but it's exempting property owned by one of the Abenaki bands from property taxes. And so that for me is such an interesting object lesson in this conversation, because on some level, it's acknowledging that this isn't, by not paying property taxes, we're saying this isn't Vermont's land and the Vermont government's land, it is the land of this band. But in order for it to work, in statute, it needs to be owned by this band. And I don't even, it's not even clear to me how much property is even owned by the bands. And when we go outside of Vermont, we have the entirely separate issue of nationally recognized tribes, which creates such a different set of legal circumstances for how land is used and shared and owned. And so I've just been trying to sort of think through the impacts of that. And also, if something is, is it possible for something to be owned by the band, both ethically and then legally? Are folks organized as a nonprofit? If they are, they probably don't have to pay property taxes anyway. So there's just like all of these really interesting questions all tied up in this bill, which is probably, not very many dollars.
Can I play devil's advocate just a little bit? Well, thank you. I was going to do it. Thank you, sweetie. If we're talking about the commons, and if taxes are one of the ways that we all support each other with common infrastructure or institutions or what have you, then if you exempt an organization, are they no longer contributing to the commons in the same way, at least financially?
Yeah. Also a good question. I don't know. Rich, what do you think of all that?
I'm really glad you brought this up. I'm aware that such a bill is in its formative stages, and I think that it can be one of those steps toward embracing a different reality on a trial level, and with a population which is probably well positioned to be in a place to implement this, indigenous people. And it's a relatively low impact as far as dollars attached to that.
Absolutely.
There is not a lot of land, very, very little land, basically zero land. I mean, talking, a few dozen acres perhaps in the entire state. And I don't know how many acres are in this state. I never looked that up, but my friend Peter Forbes, who works with the Wabanaki tribes in Maine through the First Light Learning Journey, forging connections between traditional conservation organizations and the Wabanaki peoples there. He uses this example, which applies here just as well, or even more so, that pick a number. In 1700, 100% of what is now the state of Maine was under the purview of the indigenous people of that place. Now, 1%. Whereas 28% of the state is under the purview of mainstream conservation organizations. How did that happen? And then most of the rest of it is in private hands. Now we come over here to Vermont, 100% in 1700 was under the purview of indigenous people. Basically now, probably less than 0.01%, basically zero, is under the purview of indigenous people. I don't know what the conservation number is.
It's very high.
Yeah.
Very high, right? And then we have public lands, state and federal. That's another opportunity to begin to make change with cultural access agreements. It's incremental, but you have that problem where if you're going to exempt native held lands from tax exemption, and they don't have any to begin with, it's kind of an empty gesture.
Yes.
So we need to address that too. But the tax exemption is really important in the ability of these under-resourced or unresourced groups to be able to actually work with what they're enabled with. It's enabling them, and then here's a pair of shoes. Sorry, we don't have any laces. And to answer the question about taking this group, these people, and these lands out of the commons, that equation,
the financial commons.
Yeah, the financial commons. I would offer that, given the disparity and the dispossession that is already in place, it's not asking too much to exempt from tax first. That's a small financial gesture to make. And further, I'm going to throw this in here. There's another bill in the works at some point here to address the disparity in religious bias. Churches are exempt from paying taxes. There are some sacred sites that are conserved in this state right now, indigenous sacred sites, that are still paying taxes. They are sacred sites. That is a direct religious bias. That should at least be addressed. And then if you want to carry that a little bit further, in an indigenous sense, the land is your spirituality. And should that land held by these bands be tax exempt under a religious exemption? Another idea. Again, we have to have some agreements around this so that people's fears don't rise up and say, well, they're just going to take the whole place over. It's not going to happen. Don't worry. But some of these small gestures in the way of establishing a model or a prototype, tax exemption, enabling some purchase of some land so that it can be exempt and held. How are they going to hold it? We're still stuck with the private property model.
And so under that private property model, who is the owner of that land?
Yeah, well, you may have to work with what we got, which is the nonprofit system.
Okay.
That sort of a thing. There should be some organization, sort of a third party set up in a proper manner with accountability and the right people holding that voice, those voices. So these are some things to work out, but I think this is a good direction to move in. Enable land acquisition, enable the ability to hold it, recognize that this is a very special case, while not creating, especially an elite, position, because we are all here now, and see how that runs, see how that works.
Mm-hmm.
Just a question about what you just said, Emily, about what kind of structure should own that land nonprofit. What about, and I'm forgetting the name, but like the Wyndham Solid Waste Management District is almost, it's kind of a nonprofit, but it's kind of a municipality. So I don't know, maybe that would be a structure that could work as well.
Ooh. The communications union districts are also considered municipalities, as are school districts. It's very
Kind of
weird use of words. Yes.
I'm going to throw something in here. This is like out of left field.
Oh, that's our favorite place.
Or maybe it's out of right field. I don't know. If you're following Canadian politics and indigenous intersection with Canadian politics, they have their own situations up there, which are often quite different than ours, although there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of pushback going on right now among some indigenous communities up there over Trudeau's latest innovation, which is to create a fourth level of government, municipality, another kind of municipality, and convert First Nations lands into this.
Yeah, I'd heard of that.
But the traditionalists do not like this, because they see it as it's a different form of assimilation. So it's really problematic.
When I first started studying sociology way back when, one of the first case studies that I came to understand was the emergence of sort of formal feminist organizations, specifically around violence against women. And the Women's Freedom Center is one of those sort of original organizations that was created at that time. And how they were almost always run non-hierarchically by consensus. People would sort of shift positions within the organization. And it was the process of getting grants, from the feds under the Violence Against Women Act, which people were, it was a wonderful thing that passed, and from other larger foundations, that in getting those grants and applying for those grants, they were forced to sort of create titles in order to fill out the forms. And the organization, the sort of technical sociology term is institutional isomorphism, which I think is just the funnest thing to say. But I think it's a really interesting tendency that we create when we try to, often we try to support different types of organizations within our existing structures and funding systems. And I appreciate that that's sort of being named up in the northern realms.
Well, it's almost like we need, when you have, I'm just going to, for lack of a better term, like two cultures that are trying to interact. We don't really have any good sort of in between spaces for that can allow them to to interact without needing to take on one structure or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
It sure does. I don't think the system that predominates can allow for that. It needs to change itself somehow. It has to be top down, and it has to be hierarchical, and it's the rule of law. And I uphold the rule of law, but laws aren't always equitable.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem, which we're
and
dealing
they're
with
not
all
nimble.
over.
Yeah, they're not always equitable,
And they're not
always nimble.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So can I shift?
Yes, please, because you wanted to talk a little bit about communities and
one of the
right?
Yeah. One of the things that I think is a particular dynamic when we talk about these issues in Vermont is because of the vigor of our eugenics movement, because we're, one of the earlier colonial settled lands, for a number of reasons, the identity and the connection to that identity for a lot of our indigenous peoples is really diffused, because of rape by French soldiers, because of, formal eugenics, taken on by the Vermont government, because of sort of all of the standard settler colonial practices. So many of the folks that I've met in Vermont just really identify as having Indian blood. That's the phrase they use, and don't affiliate themselves with a band or with the word Abenaki. And then within sort of folks who are able and interested in identifying with Abenaki, we have separate bands, and then people who don't affiliate with any of the formal recognized bands. And that's how life works. And that's how, I think this is because this is such a specific instance, it's sort of nameable in Vermont in this dynamic, but I think that's just as true if we look at sort of the Native American experience across America. And I think it's just as true when we talk about sort of the Black community or the Jewish community or whatever it is. And what I see happen in the legislature around these issues is people become frustrated that there's no sort of like consensus from the Abenaki community about what the right thing is to do. And that's even in the context of sort of, a group of folks that have spokespeople and have a council and are able to negotiate their way through these things, and becomes even, but we get frustrated that no one will tell us what to do from the impacted community. Because, I think we've done some decent work in the last few years as a majority white colonial legislature saying we don't know everything and we should look to impacted communities to tell us what to do. But we get totally tongue-tied because there's no one truth from any of these impacted communities. And for whatever reason, it gets the most intense when we're talking about issues around Indigenous rights. I think it might just be because we haven't sort of evolved as a legislature to be able to say out loud, like, those four Black people don't speak for all Black people. But it's a really interesting and difficult dynamic. And I'm seeing it coming up the most when we're talking about a bill to apologize for eugenics, a resolution, even not a bill. But it certainly weaves its way into all of the very limited work I've done around these issues since I joined the legislature. So really curious for your thoughts on all of that, Rich. And then down here, last detail, down here, the folks in Brattleboro that I see as sort of the strongest or loudest or most connected to me voices around these issues. My understanding is you and, can't remember her name, it just fell right out of my head.
Judy?
No, not Judy. She's a woman my age. She's a little kid.
It
It doesn't matter. But
Melody?
we have strong advocates who don't themselves identify as Abenaki. And so anyway, just in all of that mess of identity, what do you think of all that?
I'm really glad you brought this up, because that is an aspect that ends up affecting a lot of these intentions and actions, and people are not aware of that. I think you kind of laid a finger on the fact that with anyone who is not of the larger dominant group, if you're a member of a smaller minority and marginalized group, you're seen as monolithic.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not true at all. They're just human beings. And whereas someone who is speaking for an indigenous group might be questioned as, who are you to say that you're saying this? You can turn that right around and say to the person who's asking the question, do you speak for all white people? No, of course not. It is a voice. And why can't that be allowed?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't that be allowed? We don't deal with that very well, because there's so many preconceptions and assumptions built into this. I am looked at often as a resource in this area, right? As you mentioned, I am a member of Elnu Abenaki. You read in the newspapers, and the reporters will write down, Abenaki Rich Holschuh says this or that. I do not call myself Abenaki. I do not. I speak for them. They have asked me to. I am a member of a politically constructed tribe today that only came into existence 9 years ago. I don't pretend that is the be all and the end all and the final answer on anything. Let's talk about this. It doesn't need to be a problem.
No, it doesn't need to be a problem, but complexity is a problem.
Complexity is seen as a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Complexity is reality.
Yeah.
That's the real world. Everything changes all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's complex, and human beings in particular. We have these big heads, but we also have these big emotions, right? And it's all very real. That's what it means to be human. So my heritage is amongst the Wabanaki people, but not the Abenaki from Vermont. I never said that, and I never will. But I live here now, in this place, in this land, which has no voice. And the indigenous people, or their descendants of this place, have no voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to offer myself as that voice. And it's for the community. Again, it's not for the individual.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my answer to that. And again, if I am talking to somebody face to face, I have never run into anyone that has a problem with that.
No, and I guess I wonder how I can continue to support this complexity in the political spaces where I am,
Mm-hmm.
Where we're not going to get consensus on an idea from the wide diversity of humanity outside of it. In fact, we are elected because there is no way to get consensus from, the wider universe.
There you have it. Yeah. The fact that you brought this up, that's the kind of thing that needs to be brought up right at the get-go. Mm-hmm. We're talking about human beings here. This is not going to be a perfect solution, but let's sit down and talk about it, and let's do something. We can't keep putting it under the rug.
Mm-mm.
So I'm just going to throw this out here for both of you. Maybe it will be helpful, maybe it won't. But, talking about identity, talking about what needs to be named or who speaks for who, just when I reflect on my own family tree, which is when you talk about eugenics, when you talk about Abenaki, French Canadian, Abenaki, a whole other mix of other things. But, for a lot of people, even if they have lived some of these experiences, because we haven't talked about them well, and I think for a lot of people, indigenous populations in North America have been invisible. Like when we think of, Indians, we think of, oh, cowboys and Indians and the Lone Ranger and everything's the old Wild West.
And Little House on the Prairie.
And Little House on the Prairie. Yeah, don't forget them. I don't think we're as good as remembering that for a lot of folks who are indigenous, this is now, time is now, we are here now, but we as a wider culture tend to think as in the past. And so I think we haven't talked about it very much, but I think for a lot of folks too, it's, what am I looking for? It's so much the water they swim in. Mm-hmm. And so they don't necessarily realize like how to give voice to some of these things. Mm-hmm. Is that? Yeah, that's kind of what I struggle with sometimes. Like we'll have these conversations and I'll be like, oh, wait a minute, that's my family.
I know, I remembered, I think we did talk about the eugenics resolution 2 years ago. And it was when you had first started doing the show and you weren't sure how much of yourself you wanted to bring into the show. You were still sort of reckoning with your objective journalism self a little more strongly than you feel like you're in a different spot on that journey now. But yeah, it's so many folks from here, but there's so much else in the identity too. I heard this really interesting thing from a teacher, I think a high school teacher recently, that so often when we teach the African-American experience in schools, we start with slavery and we go forward from there. But if you start from now and move backwards through history, it tells a much stronger story of resilience and relationship and relatability too, right? It helps us know that, all of these people are real right next to us. And I think that's a really powerful, interesting way to talk and write about indigenous folks living in North America right now.
Mm-hmm.
Hear, hear. I agree. There's a lot of not knowing right now, and what people think they know is only coming from a very limited viewpoint, and that's the reason that Atowi came into existence, is to begin those conversations and to tell those stories, because we can't even talk about the word that gets thrown around, something like reparations. We can't talk about reparations. You don't even know what you're talking about yet. What are you repairing? How do you put a price on something that you don't even understand has happened? Before reparations comes reconciliation, and before reconciliation comes conciliation. We're not even at conciliation. So we're having those conversations now.
I've been having a lot of conversations, informal conversations with colleagues about this eugenics resolution and this pressure to do something along with the apology and not knowing what's the right thing to do. And I've been saying over and over again, why don't we just apologize and then see what happens after that? That it's not up to these other people to tell us what the remedy is on the other side of our apology. We just have to apologize and sit with that, asking for forgiveness, that we might not get the forgiveness, that we might not be offered anything in return, and that you just, in fact, say the thing sometimes on behalf of government and then see what happens next. We don't have to figure this all out at once. We can just keep on coming closer into relationship with each other for a little while.
As long as that happens.
Yeah, as long as that happens. Yes. Because you don't just do the thing and wash your hands.
Resolutions can be gestures.
Absolutely.
Can be check boxes. And how do you open up space for that conversation to happen? Yeah. That conversation does need to happen. We're not just going to check the box and move on and everything's fine now.
No.
And everyone gets to fulfill the American dream. The American dream is a nightmare. We need to have that conversation. And open that space up. But we're positioning ourselves toward doing that now. Yeah. That's what's happening with these initiatives that have happened in the legislature.
Mhm.
People are learning, people are sharing, so that we're moving in that direction.
I think one piece that might be interesting for our listeners that they might not know is that because of sort of the geography of Vermont and the geography of our political parties, there seem to be a lot more Republicans who actually identify with their family's sort of historic affiliation with the Abenaki than there are Democrats in Vermont. And so it makes these conversations really interesting because in other situations, you would assume that this would sort of fall like straight down identity politics, Democrat Republican lines. But it's a lot of the folks in sort of Franklin, Orleans, the more northern counties who are almost entirely Republican held counties and are often French Canadian and Abenaki people. And so it makes the conversations much more difficult to have, and I think much richer for it.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Thank you.
Very good observation. Oh,
Thanks.
yeah, completely true.
One perspective I bring to my journalism, and I think might be key here too, is so often we focus on mistakes and why they happened and whose fault it was, which is an important stage. But I think as a culture, we need to be better at looking at how we make repairs from a mistake and asking that question like, okay, this happened, now what? Rather than saying, well, it happened and we're just going to sit here and keep sitting on that mistake rather than moving forward. And I say that because, as a journalist, something will happen in the community and I'll go to say the town or whoever is on the hot seat at the time. And they'll be all worried about how people are perceiving them for that mistake. And the question is really, well, what's next? It's what is important now is how are you going to repair that mistake and move forward from it, if that's making any sense. We are out of time. So I think we need, unfortunately, to leave this conversation. But Rich, it's always wonderful to talk with you. And I would love to toast to both you, Emily, and you, Rich, for the wonderful work that you do in our communities. Cheers.
Cheers. Water.
I have a very empty water glass myself.
Oh dear.
I was faking it too.
It's terrible luck. I really need to be better prepared for these.
Hey everyone, the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 will return next week. Have a great weekend.